To this very nice place with the long history. Actually, we talked about this morning. I've seen the 650th anniversary of the University of Hohenheim. And what you see here on this picture is a drawing from our university headquarter building. It's an old castle in Stuttgart in the southwest of Germany. And we have just this year our 200th anniversary, so there's still a long way to catch up with your history. But actually, I can mention this anniversary because when the university was founded, it was the end of the Enlightenment period. It was 1818. And actually something happened in 1815, which was the initial event for this university foundation. It was a volcano eruption in Indonesia. The Tambora volcano erupted. It was the largest recorded volcano eruption ever. And the ash cloud was moving towards Europe, and in 816 we had in our area the year without summer. So it was a very bad harvest and the people were starving. And at that time the Herzog, the king of Württemberg, was just married with the Katharina, the daughter of the Russian Tsar, and she had the pockets full of money. Württemberg was very poor at that time. And they managed to do many things. For example, they used this old castle to install the first agricultural university in Württemberg because they thought it's a good idea to train people better in understanding how agriculture works and to increase productivity. So it was already a knowledge-based activity, and this is also what my research is about. Actually, it takes 100 years to understand why this year was without a summer. So this relationship between the volcano eruption and the bad harvest a year later was discovered 100 years later. So it is not so easy. Sometimes it takes a very long time. And I hope it's not the destiny of agent-based models as a methodology, that it will take another 80 years or so. I think we have a history of around 20 years. But we are moving in a certain direction. Of course, there are some obstacles still and some unsolved questions, and many new approaches are developing, encouraging approaches are developing at the moment. I think I'm not of the very first generation, but maybe of the second generation in the field of agent-based modeling, because it was in a European project which started in 1999, so the last millennium, when we developed the first generation of the skin model. At that time it was called SIGN model for self-emerging innovation networks. And since then we have developed it further and adapted it to different practical applications and different experiments. And there was also a nice community because we decided for an open source strategy developing around the world, which has made this program and this approach quite popular. And this is what we are heading to in the presentation today. But I will start with some general ideas about my personal motivation working with these kind of models, which comes from the field where I'm trained in innovation economics. As I said before, it's a knowledge-based activity that we want to analyze. And the question is whether we are reaching some bottlenecks in traditional economics when we talk about knowledge-driven developments. I guess most of you are familiar with the general ideas about innovation in industrial economics. And one of the things they do, and which I think is a major problem, they say that knowledge of companies can be approximated by money. So if you model innovation activities, you use the R&D expenditures as a proxy for the knowledge. If a company is investing a high amount of money in R&D, it is more likely to be successful. I think if you look in the real world, you see very quickly that this is not the case, because then large companies would always dominate, because they always have the large R&D budgets. But we see that new companies enter the scene, that they are surprisingly successful, and they are surprisingly also beaten established companies with the new technology. So money is not everything. It is of course very helpful also for costly R&D activities, but it is not the right variable to look at to understand innovation processes. So therefore, I start with the first block here, entitled Why are innovation networks the better alternative compared to spillovers when analyzing innovation processes? Details come in a minute. And then I go into the modeling field and show you how we have modeled innovation networks and the behavior of agents in these networks, and for what kind of discoveries we use these agent-based models. So let me begin with the very basic part, and I would like to start with an observation from growth theory. So of course we had this path-breaking work of Robert Solow in the 1950s when he was discovering that the largest part of the growth, economic growth in the United States cannot be explained by an increase in capital and by an increase in labor, but something else, and he was labeling this something else innovation. Unfortunately, there was nothing else to explain where does this innovation comes from. He was arguing it is falling like manna from heaven. It is just there. It's not an endogenous thing economists should be interested in. It's something exogenously happening. And this is, of course, not convincing a lot, which also leads to, say, a very slow development of growth theories until the 1980s. Then on the right-hand side, you see Paul Romer and his colleagues. They introduced what is not very creatively then called new growth theory. They added a particular element. They say that knowledge shows the feature of the public goods. And this means that if a company creates new knowledge, more or other companies can also benefit from this knowledge. There are synergies to be created, so the sum is more than the individual parts put together, and we are observing a growing process. We are not running into diminishing returns from decreasing returns on the capital stock like in the Solow model. So this was a very nice explanation, and it focused on the idea-creating features of new technological knowledge. And because of the public good features of new technological knowledge, the knowledge created by one company is available to the other companies. They cannot be excluded from using the knowledge. This is the feature of public goods. Okay, this was giving a kind of renaissance to this development in the growth theoretical realm of economics. However, the insight was not new. Already since the 1960s, with the work of Kenneth Arrow and others, these features of new technological knowledge was discussed. Knowledge was considered to be a public good. However, it was leading to the exact opposite conclusions. In industrial economics, there was an incentive-reducing interpretation of these public good features of new technological knowledge, let's call it spillovers, because companies can benefit from the R&D activities of other companies without paying for it. This is another interpretation of the meaning of public goods. And these developments, these negative considerations of the feature of public goods in innovation processes were done in the traditional modeling framework. The major points are just listed here. We have all agents which optimize. So the major motive also for deciding upon the R&D budget is profit maximization. So they are making decisions in a complete deterministic world, which also means that actually uncertainty, which is a basic feature of innovation processes, was not considered at all. It's deterministic. You know in an innovation production function already the outcome of the innovation process. The whole analysis was done in the traditional framework of equilibrium, which also says that every kind of deviating behavior from the equilibrium behavior, which is by definition an optimal state, is suboptimal and might lead to, to the exit of the agent. So it was not, say, the dynamic environment which we observe when we are looking at innovation processes. And also from social welfare theory, they take the idea of perfect competition as a benchmark. So the idea is the situation should create, the situation observed in economic reality should create the results that we find in a situation where we have perfect competition. In case there is a deviation from this, we have to intervene from a policy side point of view. So let's start with this situation, say around the 1960s, with the work of Kenneth Arrow and the knowledge consideration as a poor public good and the interpretation as an incentive reducing effect. So the idea behind this, and I think this is very important also to understand the difference to the innovation networks that we are talking about later, is this sentence here in red. The knowledge transfer is considered to happen involuntarily. So if you are developing new knowledge, you cannot prevent others from using it. So when we are opening the windows here in the seminar room of the University of Pécs, the whole knowledge generated in this university will immediately be blown in, and we cannot escape. We are just getting this knowledge. I think this is already telling you that we are not convinced by the idea of technological spillovers, which automatically are contributing to your innovation success. And if you would like to see it in a formal representation, I have developed this very didactically purpose-only model, which shows you an innovation production function. We have some of the input factors here, and in addition, and this is what you find in the literature in all these models since the 1970s, in the 1980s, you find additionally the R&D activities, the amount of money invested in research from one company, company I, plus what is called the spillover pool, ZI. And the spillover pool is just the amount of research by all the other companies in that industry multiplied with this beta parameter, which is the spillover parameter. And the idea is that knowledge is a poor public good, so we have the spillover effects and we have free riding behavior. And this is, say, how we have conceptualized spillovers in the literature in the 1980s. So knowledge, as I said, is freely available, like these guys here are stealing the energy from the truck and taking a free ride. I guess that they don't pay, maybe they pay, but I would be surprised. So they just steal the energy, and the same is happening in our industrial development processes. We open our windows and the knowledge flows in and we are just using it. And I think this, as I said, is not convincing. Okay, but let's stick to this model. The idea is that if beta is increasing, the spillover parameter is increasing, the share of public goods is becoming more important. In the maximum it can be 1. And if it's 1, then we have no incentives to invest in R&D at all. So we have a zero investment because everybody is behaving like a free rider, is waiting for somebody else to move, and nobody will move in this situation. Of course, in this situation, if you compare it with the solution a social planner would have for such a situation, the investment in R&D is suboptimal. It is a classical case of market failure, and this leads us to the basic answer of mainstream economics with respect to innovation and interventions as innovation policy. You see at the first answer here is the state himself has to produce the knowledge, like the state is producing the public goods. So we are considering that knowledge production is a public activity, something which has to be organized by the government. The second solution is to change the framework when knowledge is generated. The problem is that for public goods you cannot ask for property rights, so you can artificially introduce property rights. You can implement a system of intellectual property rights like the patent system, which is a so-called second best solution. So you monopolize knowledge for a while, usually for 20 years, so only the inventor is allowed to use the knowledge, or he can license out the knowledge. Nobody else can use it. But it's made public because everybody can read, of course, the patent document. And finally, the third form of strategies to answer this market failure idea is to subsidize research. So you can allow for tax credits, for example, that people who invest, despite they know they lose knowledge to competitors, they can reduce, for example, their tax loads. And then they have advantages, say, on the cost side, and might invest in R&D activities even if others are benefiting from this. Okay, so we are now really in the early 1980s, then this was state-of-the-art knowledge in the field. The question was quickly arised whether this is really the case. Can knowledge be analyzed adequately by making it equal to a public good, or are there other features which are valid? Some of the other features which were prominently discussed are, for example, the two first ones here, the firm specificity, like the tacitness, the Polanyi concept already introduced in the mid of the 1960s. So we cannot codify everything. We cannot write down all the elements which are necessary to make use of the knowledge. And for example, if we have a patent or a paper where we write down how technology works, it is missing important concepts. You might know this from personal experience. I think the traditional example is that you cannot train somebody to ride a bicycle on the phone. So this is impossible. You have to run next to your children, to your child, and to deliver this knowledge face to face. It's the traditional master apprenticeship knowledge, if you like, or learning process. Another example which is very relevant for me is, as I like cooking and eating, I sometimes follow the recipes of some 5-star cooks, and they write down these recipes. You can buy cooking books, and the idea is that they describe how the meal is prepared, but if you do it at home, it does not taste like in this 5-star restaurant, it does not look like this. So there's a lot of other things which is relevant for the preparation of the meal. And the same holds obviously for many technologies. So even if knowledge is codified, not everything can be codified, and therefore naturally beta has to be smaller. The second thing is something which is very specific to our economic considerations about knowledge and how we implement technologies in production functions. So generally we believe that technologies are continuous. So if we have, for example, a change in the relationship between wages and capital cost, we just move it along our indifference curve and find another optimal technology which is applying the right amount of labor and capital to minimize production costs. If you talk to engineers, they say, no, this is not existing. We have a very locally defined concept of technologies, and if one of the technologies is improving, this might not be relevant, say, in a labor-intensive technology, there's a technological improvement. This improvement might not be relevant for the more capital-intensive production process. So there is no way that somebody, even if it's the public good, can make use of the knowledge if he is not exactly applying the same technology. So instead of our continuous representation of technologies, which is nice if you are involved in production theory, engineers usually work with locally defined production points, and they say it's not possible to substitute from a more labor-intensive technology just by reducing the amount of labor, and then you move into a more capital-intensive technology. Technologically, this is not feasible. So 1 and 2 is already showing you that beta generally should be smaller than 1, which means that the incentive-reducing effects are not complete. And the second observation is also something which was introduced in the 1980s by 2 guys from the management camp, or one management researcher and one economist, Cohn and Leventhal. They introduced the concept of absorptive capacities. So if you want to integrate knowledge which is generated somewhere else, you cannot just open the window, but you have to do your own efforts in order to develop the prerequisites to understand this knowledge. And this is, of course, leading you to the situation where you have to develop your own knowledge. So those who want to benefit from spillovers are also producers of spillovers. So in a way, this incentive-reducing effect is generally reduced. And this can be added to our little model with the mu variable. Mu is just an additional weight for the spillover pool and describes the absorptive capacities. And in the Cohen-Leventhal world, which I think is too much simplified, the absorptive capacities depend on your own R&D activities. So it's a trick out of this incentive-reducing effect. If you want to make use of spillovers, you have to produce own knowledge. And if you produce your own knowledge, you produce spillovers which others might free ride on. So this is how they have solved the problem, but they show by this intellectual trick that the incentive-reducing free-riding characterization of the knowledge generation processes is not sufficient. In the same decade, in the 1980s, besides the approbability conditions, the spillover discussion, another concept was introduced, namely the technological opportunities. So far, all industries were considered as equal, and we have just a production function describing the technology of an industry. But the observation, of course, was very obvious that we have very different innovation processes when we move from textile and leather industries to biotechnology or to car manufacturing. There's no sector which has exactly the same innovation processes. Many different things matters a lot. If you invest $1 million in the car manufacturing industry in R&D, you might expect very different outcomes compared to an investment of $1 million in the leather and textile industry or in brewing. So it is, with respect to the technological opportunities, a very heterogeneous environment we are confronted with, and we have to consider this. And more important, I think, these technological opportunities are not independent. So traditionally, we think like there's a given set of technological opportunities, and then within an industry, these opportunities are exploited. So in young industries, we find a faster technological progress, addressing more product innovation. In more mature industries, we are confronted with almost exploited opportunity-based companies are addressing more process innovation, cost-reducing innovation. We have already a dominant standard. But in many cases, we find that opportunities in different industries mutually influence each other. The latest example I found really super convincing is the connection between informatics and database technologies on the one hand side and molecular biology on the other hand side. It was in the end of the 1990s when we had this competition between public research institutes and Greg Winter in the Human Genome Project. And in molecular biology, they found it necessary to generate data quantities which nobody else has ever conceived before. The amount of data disentangling this human genome was so big that all the statistical methods that we have developed in the past did not suffice to understand and to handle this. So there was this connection between molecular biology and database technologies which generated a new industry, bioinformatics. This was a very promising industry in the early 2000s, and many companies were founded, and some people talked about these companies like the Microsoft of the biotech industry. So it was really considered to be very important. Today nobody speaks about these companies anymore as bioinformatics company, but not because it disappeared, but because just the opposite. The internet has generated so many data sources and quantities of data that today it's big data. What we call the big data industries, the information service providers, it is just a follow-up of the bioinformatics industry. So they apply all these technologies which were developed for molecular biology in all fields. So it is not only a cross-fertilization that we have mentioned here, but it is what is mentioned in the last paragraph. It has become a general purpose technology. It is relevant in all industries. And you see from this example that these knowledge developments and technological developments are continuously refreshing opportunities. It depends whether you make use of this or not, and it is a highly uncertain activity, but they are not independent. So it is a little bit this difference that we know from this saying that the glass of water, let's take a glass of beer, is half full or half empty. So the pessimists say it's half empty, and they fear that they have to go home. The optimists say it's half empty because they know they are very close to refresh it and to get an extra portion by these creative mutual reinforcing effects. And this can also be integrated into our model and shows you the cul-de-sac that economics, innovation economics has reached in the 1990s. So you find the same model as before, but additionally now we have the technological opportunities, and the technological opportunities are described as dependent on my own R&D activities. This is the amount of beer I'm drinking, so decreasing the level of beer in my glass, and the spillover pool. And traditional economists say the spillover pool is contributing to the reduction of the given opportunities, whereas the Schumpeterians, the other camp which is just developing in the 1980s, the evolutionary economists, are very much convinced from the creativity, from the cross-fertilization, from the learning. It says, no, if we have external input, we might increase the opportunity level in our industry. So what you find is, in the literature, and you can take this literally, you find the three solutions. So increasing the spillover pool might decrease the opportunity space, it might be independent, or it might increase the opportunity space. So it is really worse than the situation which was described by Winston Churchill, who once said he would like to have a one-armed economic advisor. Do you know this story? So when he was saying this, I would like to have a one-armed economic advisor, he was of course asked, why are you so cruel? Why would you like to have a one-armed economist? And he says, I don't like the answers on the one hand, on the other hand. So he would like to have a clear answer. And here we have three possibilities. So it shows that actually you cannot say anything with this kind of models. So this was also leading to a, say, more dramatic change in innovation economics at that time, and the idea of isolated innovators which are doing their innovation activities in a kind of secrecy fashion without interacting with other agents was challenged by the idea of innovation networks. So first of all, it was also the period when the new growth theory developed the new insights about the idea-creating effects, and a new kind of innovation policy was also developed in this period, which is completely opposite to the traditional market failure-based approach to innovation policy. Because now the idea is that we don't have too much of these spillovers, but we have too little. We have to foster technology transfer. We have to foster the spreading out of knowledge within the economy. We don't should consider cooperation in innovation anymore as a behavior which antitrust law should take care of, but it is something which has to be fostered by policies. So we have to think about how can we generate collaborative R&D. And if you look in the development of the policy programs of that days, you suddenly find that, for example, companies in Germany like Siemens, they could not get any funding without creating a consortia with other small companies. So the government says, of course, we know you are a big player, but if we are supporting you in doing your research, if we are subsidizing you, you should show us that also other companies are benefiting, and you have to include in your projects small and medium-sized companies, or perhaps some university institutes. And I think in Finland, the Finns were most strict on this. They have very quickly created these kind of technology policy programs which asked for networks. And the same happened in Europe. Think about the European research landscapes, the consortia that were created in the framework programs. So this was a policy which of course considered that there are some interesting actors and institutes in Hungary, and maybe also some interesting researchers in Germany, but how would they collaborate? They don't know each other. So we first have to create this research landscape, and then write down these call for proposals where they say, you can apply, but you should consider that at least the members of the consortium come from 5 different countries in order to start into moving into this direction. And after 25 years with these framework programs, we have a running European research landscape. And Attila knows me and I know him, and he can invite me for a seminar, or we can even ask or write together a proposal for the next call. This is now really something which has been established within the developments in Europe, and I think it's a very large achievement, these networks. Okay, so we are now moving from technological spillovers to the idea of innovation networks, and this was a very sour and hard process for economists. So it takes quite a while. In the camp of evolutionary or Schumpeterian economics, it was already earlier. So I'm just quoting here from a famous paper from Giovanni Rossi. He says, firm cannot produce and use innovations by dipping freely into a general stock or pool of technological knowledge. So what we have said before, It's not opening the window and the knowledge enters. There's no common pool. It is not involuntary that knowledge flows. It is actually a voluntary approach. You have to explain, like, I need the cook, the five-star cook, to explain how to make the dish or to prepare the meal and to get access to this tacit knowledge. And in the camp of mainstream economics, I'm quoting here Paul Jarosky, a few years later, he's writing almost the same thing. He says, in particular, what often appears to be an involuntary flow of knowledge between firms may be nothing more than a pair of drawers from a narrow but common pool shared by a group of agents within a set of problems. So agents share the knowledge. It's a voluntary approach. It's not something which is just happening and therefore it is incentive reducing, but it is a strategy to access external knowledge. And I think it's also not very surprising that this idea of the networks came from Japan. They first have developed very concrete understandings of what they call interactive innovation processes because of the organization of the Japanese production system in these karetsus, these really dense networks of companies. They have always had these networks, but they haven't considered them to be relevant to explain the particular way they were producing. But in these 1990s, with all these, say, critical points towards, say, mainstream explanations of knowledge-based industries and their behavior, they become also aware about the role of these networks in their industries. So generally we can say that since the 2000s in modern innovation research, networks are considered as the advantageous form for organizing collective innovation processes. So, well, very small here. What you see here, almost you see nothing, are dots, red and blue dots. The blue dots are large companies, established companies in the pharmaceutical industry, and the red dots are small startup companies in the biotech industry. And they are connected by these arrows. And obviously not all the blue dots are connected with all the red dots. But we find pathways where the knowledge can travel between bilateral or through bilateral collaborations, multiple bilateral collaborations. So this is just an example of an, say, network in the pharmaceutical industry and how the pharmaceutical industry has accessed the new molecular biology knowledge. So it was not something they could develop on their own, they could not understand. The knowledge distance was very large. So they came from chemistry and the other field is biology, and it was no easy way to access this knowledge, but they did this by innovation networks. And mainstream economists at that time said, well, of course, if the large companies, this can be only a transitory phenomenon, if the large industry is not, or the established industry is not in the position to develop their own competences in biotechnology, they will disappear and the startups will become the next generation established companies. We are now 20 years later and we still see the cooperations between the established companies and the small companies. It is just because the knowledge is still growing so fast and so largely that it is still a superior strategy for the companies to form these networks. So it is not a transitory phenomenon, it's a permanent phenomenon. We still observe. Okay, this is end of part one, and now we move into the modeling approaches. And of course, not surprisingly, we have chosen the agent-based approach. And I would like to motivate this a little bit with this movie. I don't know, maybe you have seen this before. It's a very fancy experiment which was undertaken in the 1980s on a parking space in Japan. And the task was just to generate a regular movement of cars with constant speed and constant distance to the previous cars, driving in a circle. So it is not very complex. And I can easily give you the answer of an optimization problem. You would just take out all the cars and take one representative car, and then you would calculate the speed which is generating a nice, nice regular movement. Let's start it again. But what you see from the movie is, if there are many human actors, Some might speed up and they have to break down the speed, and they create all kind of fancy patterns, traffic congestions, catching up processes. It is not an easy problem to be solved because of the interactions. And this is, I think, what actually all our agent-based models address, that we are confronted with complex problems and that we can generate very unexpected patterns from understanding better these interactions and the feedbacks from these interactions. You might know this sentence from Alexander von Humboldt. He said in German language, alles ist Wechselwirkung, everything is interdependent. This is, I think, the basic philosophy which after 200 years after Alexander von Humboldt is now also possible to be implemented in models which allow us to develop a better understanding. Of course, we still have to understand that also agent-based models are simplified models. In our case, when we talk about the innovation processes, of course we can focus on the things we are really interested in. We can focus, for example, on heterogeneity. Of course, it does make sense only if we want to understand why firms exchange knowledge, if we assume there are heterogeneous firms. If we assume in a neoclassical fashion there's an optimal technology, we can work with the representative firm. And all firms have the same knowledge. Why should I cooperate with another firm? It's exactly a copy of my own, so there's nothing to be learned. It only becomes interesting when we have heterogeneity in the system, because then we can combine different knowledge and we can generate something new. And of course it is also a possible approach to allow for experimental behavior. So we move away from considering innovation as an optimization process. We have a well-defined outcome, but we understand better that nobody knows what is the outcome, but we have to try it out. We have to think about failure. I know that many of you are interested in entrepreneurship research, and I think the most common feature of young startups is that they fail. So most of them went bankrupt within a short time period. So in terms of, say, traditional economics, it's a very irrational behavior. It is much better, if I talk about my region, to get a nice job at Mercedes or at the Bosch company, and you have a 35 hours working week, instead of working 80 or 100 hours as an entrepreneur in a very uncertain environment and very likely or very high probability to fail. But we find this kind of behavior, so it is not something that we should just assume away from our models. So today, in particular in my region, we are very much concerned about it. The young people, the engineers, are too much used to get a job at Bosch, and we try to foster entrepreneurial activities, that they try out their own ideas. So I'm telling you this because it is like in the movie business. If we have a model, we have to develop a facade, an environment in which the model is embedded, which is, say, at least convincingly original in the sense that it has all the elements which we think are relevant. And we think it is relevant, for example, to fail. It is think to be relevant to combine heterogeneous knowledge. Like in this movie, so you think it's okay to have this impression to be in an early 20th century city or late 19th century city, and you don't care what is behind the walls. So it's, as a facade, it's enough. And I think this is what our models also do. We always have to keep in mind that they are models. So we don't have all the relevant insights and features and processes in the model. This becomes particularly relevant later when I will mention a little bit our idea of policy laboratories, that we can use these models as an approach to very convincingly for policymakers to use them, because they really recognize, for example, the region in these models. But very often, that is our experience, and the policymakers looks at our models and this, he sees different nodes which are interacting, or networks which we create, and says, which company is Siemens? And I think this is not what we want to tell. We can say that we have some qualitative developments in our models, which we can, of course, there are many stochastic processes, so we have to do Monte Carlo simulations or whatever. So we reproduce qualitative features, but of course we cannot reproduce individual firm histories. So when we are, for example, thinking about these policy laboratories and we calibrate the models, we don't implement a particular company, but we look at the firm size distribution. We look at the number of large firms and small firms, and in the initial values of the population in the model, we would like to see something similar, like the distribution that we find in reality. So it is still true what John Robinson once said, that a model which reproduces reality on a scale 1:1 is as useful as a map in the scale of 1:1. So the scale 1:1 is the reality, and if you want to get some understanding, we have to be abstract. And this is, I think, maybe not for you, but in general it's a very important message, because sometimes the expectations to agent-based models are also too high, and it is of course still an abstract model. Okay, let's move a little bit ahead, because we were interested in understanding better the emergence and functioning of innovation networks. And here I'm just repeating all the arguments which can be derived from the first part. We should focus no longer on the idea of spillovers, but on these learning processes. We cannot represent the knowledge by the R&D expenditures. It is something different. It is not unrelated, but it's different. We have to think about these particular frameworks where knowledge processes take place, the networks. The question which then emerges is, how can we approach the knowledge base? And this is what we have developed then in our first SIGN model already at the beginning of the 2000s in this European project where we all met. And today is called the SKIN model, Simulation of Knowledge and Innovation Networks. My two co-authors, Peter Arweiler and Nigel Gilbert, we have introduced a system which we call the KEEN. And the KEEN, not by chance, sounds equally like the gene, it also works equally. So what we are considering is, say, a layer of different knowledge fields, which we call the capabilities, the C level, the abilities, the A level, and the expertise. This first of all means that if you are specialized in a particular field of knowledge, you can be good or you can be a beginner. This is represented by the expertise field. Then the overall knowledge orientation is given by the C. So it can be, for example, biotechnology. But biotechnology is also a very heterogeneous knowledge field. So within biotechnology, you find companies in bioinformatics, for example, in gene sequencing, and in all kinds of other approaches. So there are many different abilities, and not all companies have all these abilities, but they have some of them. This is described by the value of A, and biotechnology, say the broader category, or the discipline, if you like, is described by the C. And then we can, of course, have different actors from a vertical view of the innovation system. There can be firms which are interested in the application of the knowledge and making profits out of the new knowledge. And there are universities or public research institutes which are interested in writing papers and being successful in contributing to the knowledge field. So this is, in this particular way, also represented here. We have a research direction, and this is all described here in the slide. So if I'm, for example, let's say it in the right way, if I'm a university, we say it's 0, this knowledge orientation. If I'm an absolutely applied firm, it is 9, and there are all these intermediate states. And these numbers we use, for example, to describe the differences when a basic research agent is collaborating with an applied company. So it is also that the institutional distance matters. So companies cannot easily work together with universities if they are not used to do it. So the kind of incentive mechanisms are very different. Yeah, ones would like to keep the knowledge secret, the others would like to publish a paper. How can you negotiate this? So it's not so easy to think about university-industry cooperations, and this has an impact on the result. Okay, what we are doing with this idea of keys is that we basically introduce an innovation process which looks not completely different from what innovation processes should do. Also in some standard models, we have the idea of radical research, and this is expressed by the competence level. So we have, for example, a biotechnology company which additionally includes or tries to include by hiring new people informatics in order to move into the bioinformatics field. This is what we call the radical innovation. Then we have incremental research, we have a gene sequencing focused company which additionally introduces some, I don't know, monoclonal antibodies technologies. So they become wider within their specialization. And expertise is a level which is also quite interesting because on the one hand side it shows us how experienced the company is, they learn. So every period they use the knowledge, the expertise level is increased. But of course we can also observe that some companies over longer periods don't use knowledge they have used in previous periods. And then the expertise is also decreased. Every period they don't use this knowledge, they forget a little bit. And after a while they might have lost the employees with the respective knowledge. And in case they would want to use it again, they have to relearn it. So it's about learning and forgetting. And additionally, and I think this was the big advantage of the Keen, is finally that we can allow the knowledge to develop jointly new knowledge. We allow the actors to develop jointly new knowledge. So in this example we have 3 different agents, 1, 2, 3 with their Keens, and they try to work together in a joint project. In this case it is a slide which we used for a European project where we have modeled the agents in framework programs, so they write a proposal together. Think about a proposal as an innovation, combination of new knowledge. And this does not mean that they share all the knowledge they have, but they make voluntarily the decision, I would like to give into this project this part of my knowledge, this is the most likely thing. And by doing this, of course, the other agents get access to this knowledge, but also not in a full way. Think about the concept of absorptive capacities, but they start on a low expertise level. They first have to apply it and to develop expertise in the application of the knowledge, but they have the access to the knowledge. So we have incremental research, we have radical research, we have learning by doing, and we have this combinatorial research by creating consortia or networks. And we make use out of these informations. For example, one thing which you already have seen in the examples that I've given matters is the distance between 2 different knowledge fields. If 2 different knowledge fields come together, it is very hard for them to really make benefit out of this. Interdisciplinary research is one of the most difficult things, and it takes sometimes years to understand what some political scientists or sociologists mean if they use the same notions that we use in economics. It is not the same. I can tell you, it is a very hard business and it takes a long effort. And of course, if it matches, if we finally learn to understand each other, the probability that this is a major breakthrough is quite high, because this is something nobody has done before. A nice example besides bioinformatics or big data, which I gave you before, is what I found very fascinating is this cross-fertilization between archaeologists on the one hand side at the moment and chemists in the so-called fire archaeology. They exploit the knowledge from old fireplaces and they can very detailed describe what kind of food people have eaten thousands of years ago by understanding the coals, because the coal, the CO2 structures there, the isotopes are conserving all this information, and they have generated a huge step forward in our understanding of historical processes. And nobody probably has very easily thought about the cross-fertilization between archaeologists and chemists at the first place. But it happened, and it happened to be successful. And this is something that we can also tell our program, our agent-based simulation program, that we look at the distance which we can calculate with some metric procedures in the knowledge space. If 2 actors which are very different collaborate, the probability that they are successful is very low because it is so complicated. But in case that eventually they successfully do it, it is really a more important thing than if 2 companies cooperate and exchange knowledge which is very similar. Then they increase the probability to introduce a successful innovation, but the impact of this innovation is not very significant. And another thing, for example, where we make use of this knowledge, and I will show you also some results later, is about understanding better the strategic decision making. So the companies, of course, make decisions with whom to cooperate. So they might decide to cooperate with companies which are very similar, or they might decide to cooperate with companies which are very distant in the knowledge space. But it is not made explicit. There's no statistic available, and we do not understand what exact behavior companies take. Why is this important? You can say this is not important at all. But today we are in a world where, for example, policymakers are very much interested in installing innovation networks. And we see empirically on all levels, on the regional level, on the national level, also on the European level, that most often the networks which are generated by policy programs are very unstable. So as soon as the policy support ends, the network dissolves. It's only a takeaway, a windfall profit of the actors. As long as there's something to be gathered, funding to be accessed, they participate, and when funding stops, it is dissolved. But on the other hand, we see many networks which are generated in a kind of self-organizing fashion without any policy programs, and they are very stable. And we would like to understand better what is the difference. And one of the things that is describing here the difference is the composition of the knowledge, of the common knowledge base generated by the network, the similarity or the dissimilarities of these individual knowledge bases. And therefore this is quite an interesting question. And in our case we have introduced two strategies. One we call the conservative strategy. We say that companies are collaborating more likely with companies which are equal. So we take the argument of absorptive capacities very serious and say it's the only way to cooperate, to have at least a significant overlap of the knowledge bases. Then you can also more easily or positively contribute to knowledge transfer. The other strategy is the opposite. We call it progressive strategy. They say, I would like to cooperate with agents which are very different because then I can learn the most. So I try to find partners which are very different. In 2 slides you see what is the outcome. Before that I would just like to show you the basic architecture of one of our applications. This was something that we have developed for the European Commission. First in a project and in a framework program project, and then also in a tender project, because the project officers thought that the skin model can be also used to plan Horizon 2020. So it's something like 4 years ago that they tried to change the framework programs from FP7 to FP8 by introducing new kinds of instruments. And what we said is that you can use our model as a kind of instrument which allows you an ex-ante evaluation of policy instruments. Of course, not in the sense of a crystal ball that we predict the future, but structurally we can at least use this model to show you some developments which you might be interested in. And they were very much interested in whether if they change the rules of the game, and there was a considerable change from FP7 to Horizon 2020, whether they destroy the European landscape, whether they destroy all these networks they have created in the past, or whether the network can digest this. For example, there was this plan to move forward in the area of digital health. So there was an enormous amount of money spent to bring together actors who have competences in digitalization and medicine, a community which so far did also not interact. And whether this is something which is feasible or not, they tried out to try to find out with the help, among many other things, of our model. So what you see here is the flow diagram. You see the different agents which are relevant, research institutes, established large companies and small companies. And they read the call for proposals which are published by the European Commission. They try to form networks, the research consortia, so they combine their keys and write proposals. These proposals have to meet certain criteria. So, for example, they have to be members of 5 or 6 different European countries, or you have to connect specialists from digital technologies and from medicine. and then you can meet our eligibility criteria, and then you are evaluated. In most cases, of course, we know this. There are more proposals which are eligible than money which is available. So the European Commission also has to make a decision which project they trust the most to be successful. Finally, we have some projects and funding. So the European Commission is paying the money to the research consortia, and they write the deliverables and produce new knowledge, which are then leading to perhaps some modifications in the next calls of the European Commission. So this is just an example of how we have applied in the recent past this model to very applied problems. The example I wanted to show you is dealing with another case where we have investigated what I have mentioned already as an example, the developments in the pharmaceutical industry. And here we have a quite good data set describing us the development of these innovation networks by just exploiting press information. Not we have done this, somebody else has done this. And we find, we have adjacency matrices of these networks, which actors are cooperating with other actors. And first of all, we looked at the empirical networks, and we find that, well, I think one button more, we find that according to what is generally accepted as criteria for small worlds, we find that these networks can be characterized as small worlds. So they are structures, they generate structures which very fast diffuse new knowledge, and very reliably everybody is participating or gets access to this new knowledge. This is, I think, a feature of the small world. And we also find empirically that these networks resemble scale-free networks. So we have not an equal distribution of network links, but we have some actors which are very active and some who are only partially active. So the task for us was to reproduce these structures in our simulation model. So we have no longer any consortium now in our skin model of this type, but we have small companies, startup biotech companies, and established pharmaceutical companies, and we let them interact. And you see that the small world feature was quite easily reproduced. So actually, this is something which easily can be reproduced, but not so the case of the scale-free attribute. And what you see here is a set of 8 experiments, our standard scenario, and 7 more experiments, where we have changed the parameters of the strategies, of the learning strategies, some minor modifications. And the blue boxed, this is maybe not the best presentation, the blue boxed experiments are the experiments here, which have the feature of a scale-free attribute, and the black experiments did not show the feature of a scale-free network. So the networks that we have generated after a few of the simulations are not scale-free networks. And we found out, and basically we found out by chance, that we can make a pattern from these experiments. Because we found that for only one of our learning strategies, remember the conservative and the progressive strategy, we find scale-free networks. And what do you think? Which strategy, the progressive strategy or the conservative strategy, is reproducing the networks that we find in the pharmaceutical industry? You have an idea? Remember, progressive was the strategy where we have the idea to cooperate with very different partners in knowledge terms. The conservative strategy was the strategy where we thought it is better to have a minimum common understanding. And the answer is the conservative strategy. So with the absorptive capacity argument really matters. So in a way it's, say, also a very late agent-based conferment of Kohn and Leventhal ideas. It is impossible to reproduce a link distribution in an artificial network if you have the progressive strategy. And actually the progressive strategy is something which very often drives policy programs. So they have the idea, for example, to bring together medicine and digital technologies, and they do it without considering other things. And this is a very unstable environment in many cases, which is working as long as you do the funding of the network, but if you take away the funding, the network dissolves. So I think that's also a very relevant result for designing innovation policies. This already, oh, sorry for taking too much of your time, brings me to the last slide, summarizing what has been said. I think all the points have been mentioned. It is, in our eyes, a very flexible tool, the agent-based model. So the skin environment is something which we really can easily transfer to different problems or to different regions. This is one of the latest things that we are doing, that we are considering to use this kind of model for looking at a particular region for which we have very good empirical information, so we can start to think about calibration of this model and to develop smaller scale applications, which are of course very interesting as policy laboratories for the local policy makers, because then when they look at the graphical user interface with some explanations, they can re-recognize the region. This is something they usually don't do in traditional econometric work on their region. They see a lot of significant variables and asterisks and 5% and 10% levels, but they don't understand what is going on. With the help of the agent-based models, you generate an environment with which they can work. They can try to play with the developments in the region, and they start to intuitively develop knowledge about the complexities of the processes. So back to Humboldt, everything is interrelated, alles ist Wechselwirkung. It is that most often they were used to get some advices from, say, our colleagues from traditional, using traditional technologies, which are very linear. They work for a while, but then they generate very unexpected surprises. They don't work anymore. And this is the possibility to extend the time horizon and to develop an intuition, I would say, for the complex phenomena they are confronted with. Next slide is very short. Thank you. But I have one more, two more actually, just as an offer. As you have seen, I was not presenting a single paper, but it has some history, this model, and you find all these papers mentioned on my website, and if you find anything difficult to approach, just write a message to me, and I'm very happy to share the papers and chapters with you. Okay, thank you again.
Thank you.